Is Europe preparing to fight Russia in the aftermath in 2029, 2030? Here is, before going to the question, that my question, here is what the UK Chief of Defense said, Scott.
Russia's track record shows Putin's willingness to target neighbouring states, including their children and civilian populations. The Russian leadership has made clear that it wishes to challenge, limit, divide and ultimately destroy NATO. A new era for defence doesn't just mean our military and government stepping up, as we are. It means our whole nation stepping up. And to do that, we need to contribute to that national conversation and bring these issues into the mainstream, just as our allies in many countries in
What are they cooking for the conflict in Ukraine? Do you see escalation, and how capable is the United Kingdom, for example, to go in that direction?
Well, they're led by this gentleman who has nothing but Jubilee medals on his chest. Okay, he's never seen combat, doesn't know what combat is. I don't think he's deployed outside of the United Kingdom. He's been a rear echelon something forever. And yet he's sitting there talking the language of war. He has about as much credibility as my pinky. My pinky's been to more war than he has. So no. Understand that his presentation came simultaneously with the presentation of Blaise, the last name begins with an M, Georgian derivation. Grandfather was a horrible Nazi war criminal, Ukrainian, who committed horrific crimes, probably died, hopefully screaming and suffering in 1944 when the Russians carried out their counterattack, pushing the Nazi forces out of what's left of Belarus. But we don't know. Hopefully he's dead. Probably dead. Hopefully he died then. But, she survived. She claims she never knew him, but all that. But when you deal with the Ukrainian diaspora like I have, and you understand they never forget their past, and they celebrate their past. But, Blaise gave a presentation too the same day. Ask yourself, why is the defense chief and the intelligence chief, who are implementers of policy, they don't make policy. They don't make policy. So why are they out there making policy, suggesting policy? It's an information operation. Okay, the United Kingdom can't go to war against Russia. Literally, they can't. They've got nothing, zero. And Blaise runs an organization that does hybrid warfare. I mean, the hypocrisy of this woman, knowing what the British are doing today in Ukraine, knowing how the British have empowered the Ukrainian special forces and intelligence service to carry out acts of terrorism against Russia, and indeed now the world. The drone attack that took place in the Mediterranean, the British did that. The drone attacks that are taking place in the Black Sea, the British are doing that. The Russians know that. Operation Paperclip, or whatever the hell they called that, not a paperclip, the drone operation that took place in Ukraine in June, where they had trucks launch drones. British conceived operations sustained by the British. So she's sitting there saying the Russians are doing hybrid war. No, Blaise, you're doing hybrid warfare. But why are they talking? Because this is an information operation. This is about creating perceptions. And what are they trying to achieve? And again, I say this as an American who's fully aware of what the British are trying to do. They are desperate to stop Donald Trump from implementing his national security strategy. They are doing their best to keep Ukraine in the fight. They need Ukraine to be sustainable and viable through the midterm elections. They're trying to wait out Donald Trump, and they're actively putting their thumb on the scale of American domestic politics. I mean, we sit there and go, oh, the Russians did this, the Russians didn't do anything, we now know. But the British do. The Europeans are, as we speak. They're in here in the United States doling out money. They're in here buying political allies. And the goal is to generate enough opposition to Donald Trump so that his plans get stymied by a Democratic Congress, who will then once again repeat what happened the last term, seeking to impeach, 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 paralyze Trump. That's what's happening here. The British aren't going to war with Russia because the British can't go to war with Russia. NATO can't. NATO is dissolving as we speak. Literally, it's breaking apart. It's fundamentally broken. They will never resurrect this beast. It will not be Lazarus, raised from the dead with the magic touch of Mark Rutte. NATO's finished. They're not trying to save NATO. They're using the perception of a resurrected NATO to create political momentum to get them through the summer of 2026, through the silly season of American politics, in hopes that they can perform a miracle and end up, paralyzing Donald Trump politically by empowering the Democrats to take control of at least, one house of Congress. That's what's happening here.
I think the whole plan right now for Europeans is to outlast, the Trump administration. They know that with the Trump administration, they cannot achieve what they have in their mind in terms of the continuation of the conflict. That was somehow, that was said by Zelensky yesterday. Here is what he said, Scott.
United States have their policy. They don't see us in NATO. For now. Everything in our lives is for now. Maybe the position will change in the future. Maybe somebody will come to realize that strong Ukrainian army strengthens NATO, not vice versa. Politicians change. Somebody lives, somebody dies. And it's life.
These words are not Zelensky's. I think.
No, they're British words. They're written by MI6. They're written by Blaze. We know who writes these words. He just threatened the American president. If I were the president of the United States, he'd be a dead man by now. I would have killed him. You don't get to threaten the president of the United States. Not that little punk ass dude. No. But, hopefully Trump is doing the right thing. And the right thing is to destroy this pathetic excuse of a human being, eliminate his corrupt regime, and get Ukraine on the track of never being able again to promote this kind of disarray globally, because Ukraine is the single most destabilizing force in the world today, even more so than Israel, because Ukraine is doing its best to create the conditions that could lead to a nuclear war. They're disruptive of arms control. They're disruptive of European security and stability. They're disruptive of global economics. I mean, because of Ukraine, the European Union is threatening to unravel the entire system that's used to sustain trade amongst nations. For what? This pathetic little country of Western Ukrainian, governed by Western Ukrainian nationalists who exist only to kill people who aren't Western Ukrainian nationalists. Go back and read the statements made by Stepan Bandera in a Polish court after he was arrested and tried for the murder of a Polish prosecutor, when he talked about the willingness to commit millions of murders if it gives them a Western Ukrainian state. I mean, this is, extreme nationalism, and it exists today. Listen to what the Ukrainian nationalists are saying about, continuing this war, what they're willing to do. Look at how prevalent they're becoming now. This war has brought about a lot of radicalism, and we saw Azov go from a battalion to a regiment, to a brigade, to a corps, and to several corps now. I mean, they're literally about 1/3 of the Ukrainian military. The most loyal, fanatic fighters are located in these Nazi units that have become the heart and soul of the Ukrainian military. And people need to understand that when the Ukrainians lose, and they will lose, and when the Ukrainian military collapses, and they will collapse, Zelensky has hinted on this. There will be a civil war in Ukraine, because these Nazis will not allow themselves to be disarmed. So there will be a civil war. That's where we're at today.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw the report in Chinese portal Sohu. They reported that in the event of an attack on Kaliningrad, nothing will remain of Europe. They're talking about 34 million people will die in 5 hours. Do you think that the things that can get that crazy, somehow
Who's that
like,
crazy? Who's that crazy?
no, no, this is a report on the Chinese portal.
No, what
So
I'm saying is, do I think who's that crazy?
I'm talking about Europeans, basically German and the United Kingdom.
They need to
Because
understand they will cease to exist. I just did an interview. I don't want to give it away too much because I want people to watch it with Sergei Karaganov. He's a very noted Russian thinker, very influential. He wrote a paper a couple of years ago where he postulated the notion that the United States would not trade Boston for Poznan. And what he's saying is that Russia needs to preemptively hit Europe with nuclear weapons because he doesn't believe the United States will sacrifice America for this crazy Europe. Now, he made that back when Biden was president. He made that statement. Today we have Trump, and it's clear. Understand, Scott Bessent has told the Europeans that if Russia attacks a European country, the Article 5 response from the United States will be to sell NATO weapons, but not to get involved militarily. All right. And now we have a situation where Europe is deliberately provoking Russia in contravention of the policy direction desired by the President of the United States. So now, if NATO attacks Kaliningrad, the Russians will immediately annihilate Europe. 34 million dead, if you're lucky, could be more. And there won't be a damn thing the United States will do about it because we're not going to sacrifice 150 million Americans for the stupidity of Europe. And people need to stop blaming Russia for this. Russia's the one that actually, they're the only ones out there with an arms control plan. They want to extend New START. The United States isn't responding to that. Russia is willing to sit down and talk about any aspect of anything as long as it's done within a framework that respects the legitimate national security interests of Russia. So people have to start asking us, what are you willing to die for if you're European right now? Because if you allow the insanity of the Poles, of the Balts, of the Germans to manifest itself, because remember, Germany has a brigade right now in Lithuania. It's a joke of a brigade. It can't do anything. But my God, we have German tanks in Lithuania posturing to fight the Russians. Is this 1943 all over again? Yes, it is. But you had General Donahue talk about, well, we can shut out the lights in Kaliningrad. No, we can't. General Donahue, no, you can't. First of all, I've said this. I said it at the time. I'll say it again. General Donahue, if he's the commander of NATO forces, will be dead within an hour of NATO forces striking Kaliningrad, because the Russians will just simply take out his command and control facility with a nuclear weapon, and he'll be dead. And so will all the nuclear planners. And then shortly thereafter, the political leadership of Europe will be annihilated as well, as Russia will immediately destroy Europe. Not a single major European city will be left standing. Why? Because Europe poses a threat to Russia, an existential threat. And you don't let rabid dogs run free in your cities. I've said this all along. Russia will become the modern day equivalent of Atticus Finch, and they will pull out the rifle reluctantly, and they will put a bullet through the skull of the rabid dog that is Europe today. I mean, this is harsh talk, but my God, this is what we're talking about. This isn't a joke anymore. This isn't, posturing. Russia's not weak. I mean, Seymour Hersh is a very good friend of mine. I love the man to death, and I have the highest respect for him as a journalist. But he has allowed himself to be hijacked by U.S. sources that just promulgate bullshit, straight up crap. And he's written an article now that, he does say that in the opinion of U.S. sources. But why give them a platform? Because the impression is that you agree with them. And these sources are that, the Russian army is in disarray. No, not even close. The Russian army is a fully functioning war machine that has, mastered the art of modern day high intensity conflict. Can you point to, a problem here, a problem there? Of course you can. When you have 710,000 soldiers on the line carrying out, intensive combat, there will be people who don't perform well. There will be people who decide they don't want to be there. There will be this, that, and the other thing. But hell, that happens everywhere. I mean, do we judge the United States military because in 1944 we had American soldiers drop their weapons and desert the battlefield? Does that show that there is a systemic problem in the American military, or is the American military one of the finest fighting forces ever, formed at that time, and went on to, defeat Nazi Germany on the Western Front? The Russians right now are pretty damn good at what they do. They're very good at what they do. A military in disarray. What about the Rubicon Center? This is the drone warfare unit that the Ministry of Defense has created, an elite force, and even the Ukrainians are like, we can't touch these guys. They're created to kill Ukrainian drone operators. When Rubicon shows up, the Ukrainians know they're about to die, because that's what happens. The supremacy of drone warfare. This is what Pete Hegseth and Army Secretary Driscoll say they want the Americans to be, but the Americans aren't even anywhere close to this. We can't even touch what the Russians are doing right now. Then the Russians have consolidated a drone fighting force into an unmanned, vehicle group. It's a new service. The Ukrainians did it. Ukrainians are pretty damn good too. I mean, in some cases, they're probably better in certain tactical applications, but the Russians have caught up and surpassed them, and strategically, the Russians are dominating this. A military in disarray doesn't do that. The Russians have the ability, they're the quickest turnaround in terms of learning the lessons of war. The Russians are rotating their troops out of the front line on a regular basis. That means that the troops are well rested, and when they rotate out, in addition to resting, and re-equipping, they get retrained based upon the most recent doctrinal lessons that are gathered from the battlefield, taken to the Russian general staff academies and their other fighting academies, where they train, they come up with doctrine, they update it, bring it back down to the training centers. So you could have done an assault on Pokrovsk, captured the town. The lessons that you learned from that battle are taken up to the General Staff Academy while you're rotated out to get rest and re-equipped. And before you come back in, there will be a training academy that trains you on adapting the lessons that you learned. And then you go back in and you fight. Nobody in the world can do that. That's not a military in disarray. That's a military that knows what the hell they're doing. And they're pretty damn good. They're not exhausted. Would they like the war to end? Who wouldn't want the war to end? Everybody wants this war to end. But the Russians will not accept the war ending without victory. And victory is defined by, the Russian leadership, who has the full support of the Russian people. Is the Russian economy suffering? Did you watch Vladimir Putin's, 3+ hour question and answer this morning? How many of those questions were about the economy? A whole bunch of them. And was this an economy that's thriving, or are people calling up saying, hey, there's problems here? There's a taxation burden. There's shortages of fish. You're going through it. Is the Russian government hiding any of this? No. They actually created a forum for the entire world to watch, where Russia's economic problems are put out there, where they discussed everything, to include the Russian central bank and the role that it plays in handling inflation. And Vladimir Putin is sitting here saying, we have problems. We're adjusting to this. We have to make adjustments here. We have to do that. That's a deficiency here. We're working on this here. He's not trying to fake people out. But what you're seeing is a nation that is functioning at every level. Functioning. There are problems. Who wouldn't have problems? 20 tranches of sanctions put on Russia from Europe, the seizure of $240 billion of their national assets, the United States sanctioning energy, disrupting, how they derive income. Who wouldn't have issues? But Russia, I've been there, and I'd recommend you go there too, and not talk to people in Washington, D.C. who have never been there.